Hello everyone. Today we will talk about DAX. DAX means data analysis expressions and is a language of formulas and expressions where you can use it on Power BI, Excel Power Pivot, SQL Server and Azure Analysis Services. DAX was created to work with relational data models. DAX uses expressions in full tables and works with contexts. You can create calculated columns, calculated tables, and with these kind of mechanisms, you can produce advanced analysis. The most important thing to work with DAX is to understand how it works the contexts. There are two types of contexts, the raw context and the filter context. The raw context means the context that is being used when DAX evaluates a line on a table. The filter context represents the group of active filters that are working during an evaluation of a formula. With this in mind, let's put hands on. Now let's create the relationships between the dimension tables and the fact tables. Here, the colored columns are the columns that relate the data between the dimension tables and the fact tables. The cardinality is one to many. This means that one row from the dimension table is related to one or more rows on the fact table. The cross-filter direction is single, from the dim location to the fact payments. Sometimes you want to create measures from the many side to the one side, which is the opposite direction from the propagation. If you want to do that, you can do it with some specific measures. And also, sometimes you want to control the context when you have bidirectional cross-filter directions. On this kind of cross-filter direction, you have to be aware the way you propagate the filter. Because if you don't do that, you can create wrong measures. Now, let's create the other relationships. That will be the same. Same here. And the same here. Now, let's create the relationships to the other fact table. Every of these dimensions is a single direction dimension. This doesn't have. Okay. This one, if you take a look to the fact table, to this fact table, the fact deliveries, you have more than one attribute that is related with the calendar dimension. And you can do that. This is a role-playing dimension. But if you take a look to the lines, you have only one that is not a dashed line. This is the active relationship. This is important when you are creating measures because the active relationship will be the way that the measures will be propagated. If you want, you can force some measures to use the dashed relationships, so the non-active relationships. And you can do that with the use relationship formula. And here it is, our dimensions are related to the fact tables. Now that we have our data model, let's create some measures. Let's imagine that we want to know how many payments we have for each location. And we want to calculate it on the dim location. To do that, you can calculate this using the related table. The related table calculates this count of rows from the many side to the one side. If you want to do the opposite, you can use the related formula. So let's create on the dim location a new column. Let's call it number of payments. This will be count rows of related table fact payments. And as you can see, you have the number of payments for each location. We don't want empty rows, so let's use collages. Okay, and here it is. Now, let's imagine that if you want to create on the dim location a measure that counts the number of split purchases that we have from the dim payment type. If you do that, let's create it. Number of payment type. That will be the counter rows of related table dim payment type. And as you can see, every single row has the same value. Why? This happens because the chain of relationships is propagating on different ways. Here, the dim payment type has a relation from one to many to the fact payments, which is the same than we have on the dim location. So if you want to make this kind of measures, this chain of relationships should be to the same side. So here you should have the opposite, from one to many, which doesn't make sense on this case. So be aware when you create these calculated columns. Let's create a new measure inside the fact deliveries and let's call it orders. Orders will be the distinct count of the order keys inside the fact deliveries. Okay. So one of your requirements to your data model, let's suppose that your data model has to answer to multiple departments that has different perspectives from what they count to the number of orders per month. For instance, sometime if you are in a financial department, maybe you want to evaluate the number of orders taking account the purchase date key. But if you work in an operational department, maybe you want to evaluate the total of orders taking in account the approved date key or some other key, date key. So if you want, you can force an expression to use a different kind of relationship that is not active. So to do that, let's first of all create an auxiliary table. Let's call it date type. That will be a data table with a column called date type, where you will have string values, and you will put 4 values: the purchase date, the approved date, the delivery date client, and the delivery date to the postal service. Okay, and here it is, our auxiliary table. Now, imagine you will put a slicer with this attribute, and also a timeline slicer where you will put some kind of selection. Let's put it to the last semester of 2016. Okay. Now let's create our measure that, taking in account what you choose on your slicer, will switch the way that the formula will be evaluated. So now we will create a new measure. Let's call it orders by date type. To this formula we will have a variable. Let's call it selected date type, that will be the selected value of date type, and when you don't have any kind of value chosen, the default value will be the purchase date. Now let's create how we will work with the expression. So we will use switch depending of the selected date type, and when it is purchase date, then you want the value of orders that we will create previously. If the select date type is approved date, then you want to use the most powerful function on DAX, which is the calculate, where you can control and create specific contexts to evaluate some kind of formula. And here you want to calculate the orders taking in account the relationship between the ID of the calendar dimension and the approved date key. And you will have to produce this formula to the other possible values, like the delivery date client, and on this time you want to calculate the orders taking in account the delivery date client key. And also you want to create how to evaluate the formula when the chosen value is the delivery date to the postal service. On this case, you want to choose the delivery date postal service, and here it is, our formula. Now let's test it. Let's put the formula inside our table, and as you can see, if you choose the purchase date, the value will not change because this is the default value. But if you choose another attribute like the delivery date postal service, your formula is evaluated using the context that you put inside the calculate. As a conclusion of DAX, understand clearly how context works. This is very important. Almost everything can be solved with measures. Calculated columns are useful when you need a row-by-row value, but use it only if you must need. And know your data. This is the most important thing. So it's enough for today. I hope you enjoy. See you on next time on Book Building Our Own Knowledge.